Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3. If you're not already turned there, we're going to spend some time in that text, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Our theme for 2022 is foundations. And we're thinking about that, especially this month. I've taken some time to have several lessons just for the month of January focused on that. But, what good is a foundation if we do not build something on top of it? In previous lessons, we've made it clear that we need a solid foundation in God. God is our rock. Psalm chapter 11 says, if we don't have a foundation, what will we do? Additionally, we've learned from Matthew 7 that Jesus must be the foundation that we build upon, or our house is headed for trouble. And you can build your life on the rock, that's Jesus Christ and His teachings, or you can build your life on the sand. Today, what we want to think about is the building on top of the foundation. And we want to consider those who are doing the building. And 1 Corinthians 3 addresses both of those things. 1 Corinthians 3:9 says, you are God's building. So we're not talking about a physical structure here. When we think about that, the physical structure helps us understand more about the spiritual structure that exists. The you that Paul refers to is the church. He's referring to the people of God who are added to the church as living stones. And 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5 also uses this symbolism, as does Ephesians chapter 2. But 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5 says that we should come to Jesus as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, as living stones, you are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so Peter uses the figure of a house. Paul uses the figure of a building in 1 Corinthians 3 and Ephesians 2. And we want to think a little bit about what that means. So let's walk through the context of 1 Corinthians 3 and try to think about what Paul's trying to impress upon the church as he teaches. So one of the first things that I want to consider about what it means when we are God's building is it means that we do not belong to any human. You don't belong to any man or to any human. Take a look at 1 Corinthians 3 and let's understand why that was an important lesson for the people in Corinth to realize. He says, I, brethren, cannot speak to you as to spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. So Corinth has a problem. They are fleshly minded. He says you're carnally minded. You're not spiritually minded. Now, what's the evidence of that carnal mind? He says in verse 2, I fed you with milk and not with solid food. And it's kind of an insulting thing to say if you're a Christian. I mean, at some point when we are new Christians, we need the milk of the word. But eventually, we should be able to move on to the meat of the word, and Corinth had not gotten there yet. He says, until now, you are not able to receive it, and even now, you are still not able. He says, I'm still not sure you're ready for everything you need to be taught because you're just still babes in Christ in maturity. He says, you're still carnal, verse 3. Where there is envy and strife and divisions among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men? What's the evidence of their carnal nature, that they're not spiritually minded? He says there's envy among you, there's strife, there's people arguing with one another, there is divisions among you. What specifically were they dividing about? Verse 4 tells us. It says, one of you says, I am of Paul. Another one says, I am of Apollos. They're arguing about their favorite teachers and favorite preachers. And he says you're dividing over that. There's a couple of other names that are mentioned in the first chapter. And so, Paul goes on to say in verse 5, who is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And so then neither he who plants, that be Paul talking about himself, is anything, nor he who waters. That's Paul talking about Apollos. He says we're not really anything because God is ultimately the one working through us, and God is the one who's giving the increase, verse 7 says. So he who plants and he who waters are one. He says we're not divided. Apollos and I, we're not divided. I'm not divided with Apollos. Apollos is not divided with me. We're actually working together. We're not in competition with each other, so you shouldn't be putting us in competition with one another as a church. That's what Paul's trying to get across. He says, each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. We're just laborers. We're just workers. And he says that in verse 9. We are God's fellow workers. There's not one of us more supreme than the other, one more higher ranking than the other. We are fellow workers. We are on an equality with one another. And he says, you are God's field. We've been planting you and watering you. You are God's building. We've been laying the foundation for you, and you need to be building upon that. And so contextually, what Paul's trying to get across to Corinth is that they need to realize they don't belong to any human. You're not Paul's disciples, Apollos' disciples, Peter's disciples, or any other preacher that preaches to you. You are the disciples of Jesus. You don't belong to any human. The Corinthians, though, were struggling with exalting different preachers. And if you'll think about the Corinthian mindset, we're talking about people who are deeply entrenched in Grecian culture. This was very much the Grecian way. They exalted their Greek philosophers. Some were followers of Plato and some of Socrates and Epicurus. Paul even deals with the Epicureans and the Stoics in Acts chapter 17, as it's mentioned. And so they were accustomed to following the most popular philosophers of their day, following them as their leaders, picking out whom they thought was the best one of all of the debaters and philosophers. But Paul says in the church, that's not how it works. That's not how it's supposed to be. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, you see that Paul starts out his letter dealing with this very problem. He says in verse 12, there's contentions among you, and here's how it's evidenced. Some say, I am of Paul. I follow Apollos. I follow Cephas. I follow Christ. He says, is Christ divided? And the answer is no. Was Paul crucified for you? No. Were you baptized in the name of Paul? No. And so quit following all of these human beings who are simply vessels of God, and certainly not God himself. While various preachers are involved in God's field as planters or waterers, and I want you to think a little bit about what that means to be a planter or waterer. Some people are the people who are involved, who helped teach you the gospel in the first place. Those people, in a sense, are planters. They're the ones who first planted the seed of God in your hearts, the gospel in your hearts. But then there's other people who come along later who maybe preach and teach to you, and they just water that seed a little bit more. So they help you continue to grow in Christ. Well, Paul was the first one in Corinth to preach the gospel, so he's the planter. He's the one that's laying the foundation. So we've got two metaphors going on here, a field and a building. And he's the planter, he's the foundation layer, but he says Apollos comes along later, and he's the waterer, and he's the one that's continuing to build on the foundation. And so whether we are planters or waterers, or whether we are concrete pourers or stonemasons, the church is not built on humans, on men. So let's think about how we might apply that. When you start calling yourself a disciple of any of the popular reformers, for example, and you start saying, well, I'm a Wesleyan, or I'm a Lutheran, or I am a Calvinist, or even if you were to call yourself a Campbellite or something like that, you are missing this point. The point is, we are not followers of any human. When you start quoting popular religious authors, saying, I'm a follower of Osteen, I really like Francis Chan, I really like this author, MacArthur, this preacher. When you start quoting those authors and those social media messengers, I see people do this all the time. They get on social media and they quote from some popular author, or somebody wrote something that they shared. When we start talking up popular podcasters or putting certain preachers on a pedestal to the point that we will hear and believe anything they say above anyone else, then we are in the same type of danger as the Corinthian church was. We are being carnal. We are being fleshly minded. And that's an important concept to consider when we are sometimes guilty of exalting certain men as our mentors, or when we have a little bit of a case of preacheritis. it's not about the preacher. It is about the one he preaches. And any preacher who's preaching the gospel of Christ is going to make it about the one we preach and not about us. And so that's the first point that Paul's trying to get across. We don't belong to any human, so who do we belong to? Well, the second point I want to consider is you belong to God. Notice what he says 3 times in verse 9 to make a point about ownership. Paul and Apollos, who do they belong to? They are God's fellow workers. They are not in competition with one another. They are working in coordination with God and with one another. Then he says the church is God's field. The church does not belong to a preacher, but to God. I've heard people ask me, where is your church? I think I kind of know what they mean when they say that, but I try to stop them a little bit. It's not mine. It's Jesus' church. And I've heard people say when I've, for example, moved to a new work, oh, you got yourself your own church. It's not my church, not at all. And so I just want to correct that concept when people say that, because that is sometimes a very denominational way of thinking, that the disciples are the disciples of the preacher or the pastor of the church. You are not my disciples. You are the disciples of Jesus Christ. And I just happen to be one person who is involved in teaching and preaching and sharing Jesus with you, among others who do that here as well. And so the church is God's field. It is God's building. God is the one who has ownership. And so the implication of that possessive noun in verse 9 is that we must realize that God has ownership of his people, not man. So since this is the case, it is our goal as God's people to glorify God, to glorify him. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. One of the problems in Corinth was a problem of sexual immorality that was taking place there. And so one of the points that Paul makes as he gets to chapter 6, which I think just continues with this same idea that's in chapter 3, he says, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. Okay? And so it's not just that any man, no man has the right to have ownership of us. He says, you actually don't even have ownership of yourself, in a sense. God has ownership of you. He says, you were bought at a price, and therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. God owns you. You are God's building. And so it is your job with your building, with your body, and with the church to glorify him, because the body and the building belongs to God. Now, a third point that we might consider as we look through 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is that the builder must use the architect's blueprint. And in a sense, we are all to be builders. We're all living stones. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 10 and 11. Paul says, according to the grace of God which was given to me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. Well, who was the other who came and built on it? That was Apollos, who came later. And there would be other preachers and teachers who would come later. But he says, let each one take heed how he builds on it. We have to be very careful about the work that we are doing in the Lord's church. He says, for, verse 11, no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. If someone comes trying to build on the church with something other than Jesus, then they're building the wrong way. So God had given to Paul the blueprints. That's the idea behind the wise master builder. He's kind of the architect here. All right? He's the one who's got the blueprints. And so God had given to Paul the blueprints, and he laid the foundation. He planted the church in Corinth. If you'll look at Acts chapter 18, notice with me how the book of Acts records Paul coming to Corinth and doing his work in that city. In verse 1, it says, Paul departed from Athens. He leaves Athens. He comes to Corinth. and he finds Aquila and Priscilla, who are also fellow tent makers there, and he works with them for a while. And then in verse 4, it says he goes into the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. And when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit. He testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So who's the first one who preaches the message that Jesus is the Christ in Corinth? Well, it's Paul. He says when Silas and Timothy came and joined him, he started preaching that. But they opposed him. They blasphemed. They shook their garments, and they said, "Your blood," and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean from now, and I will go to the Gentiles." So Paul says, if the Jews aren't going to hear it, I'm going to go to the Gentile people. He departed from there. He entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God. His house just happened to be next door to the synagogue. I kind of love that. All right, you people in the synagogue aren't going to hear. I'm just going to go door knocking. And he finds somebody right next door, and it's Justus. And he goes in there and he shares the gospel with him. And then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. So Paul's doing the planting here. He's got the key to the church, the foundation, the cornerstone, that's Jesus Christ. He testifies about Christ, and so he lays the foundation. After Paul, Apollos arrived, and he greatly helped. Take a look at Acts chapter 18, and now notice verse 26. Aquila and Priscilla explained the way of God more accurately to Apollos because he was still preaching the baptism of John. And in verse 27, when he desired to cross to Achaia, this is Apollos going to Achaia, leaving Ephesus where he was. And it says, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. Notice he's already teaching people who are already believers. How were they already believers? Well, Paul had already been there. He'd already planted the church. And Apollos was coming into Corinth, and he was watering the church. Both, though, were careful to take heed that they built up the church with the message of Jesus. And so the key point that Paul makes is we are to be extremely careful, whether you are founding or whether you are building in the church, that Jesus remains the focal point. It is his church, and he holds the blueprints for how it must be built. The original confession of Peter is that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and it was Jesus who said, upon this rock I will build my church. We need to be all building upon that rock. That's Jesus. A fourth thing to consider, though, and this is especially for preachers and for teachers. It's for us who try to raise our children in the Lord, who try to teach our neighbors, that the quality of our work is going to be revealed. Look at 1 Corinthians 3:12 through 15 now. It says, if anyone builds on this foundation, okay, that's the foundation that Paul's laid. It's the foundation where Apollos came and also laid a few more stones. He says, but if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it. Tell me something. Anybody got an English standard that you're reading from out there right now? Is day capitalized? You have the word day in there? Is that capitalized in English standard? I didn't check that. Yeah, okay. It's capitalized. I've got the New King James that I read from, and it's capitalized here as well, and that assumes something. That's the translators of the text assuming something, that that's the judgment day. Each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire. The fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he'll receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Now, I want you to think about what this passage means. Verse 13 says, each one's work will become clear, and it will be revealed by fire. Now, it could refer to really a couple different things. This could refer to the fiery trials that we have here on earth, okay? And we will have those. 1 Peter says that don't think it's strange when you have to endure fiery trials. It could also refer to the fire of Judgment Day. And 2 Peter chapter 3 also will use the idea of fire when it comes to the judgment day and that the earth will be burned up. I don't think it really matters which interpretation you take, if you take one. The point is this: the builder's job, the people who are building upon Jesus Christ, is to prepare and to strengthen his building to be ready for these fires. So whether that be the trials and temptations that you must endure while you are here on earth, it is our job as preachers and teachers to prepare you and equip you to persevere and to endure through those difficulties. And sometimes it's an indication that maybe we haven't done as good of a job as we should be doing preparing you for that when you fail as those difficulties arise. Likewise, it is our job to prepare you for the final judgment. Because one day, this world is going to be destroyed by fire. There will be a new heavens and a new earth, and I want you to be prepared for that. And so Paul, essentially, what he does in chapter 3 is he puts our building into one of two classes. I've always had a hard time understanding, what is this gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw? Maybe I overthink it a little bit, but I think the simple idea is this, that when it comes to who you are as a building in God, you are in one of two classes. You are the gold, you are the silver, you are the precious stones. And gold, silver, and stones are often able to endure and are even purified through fire. And some Christians are like that. Some Christians, through trials and through temptations, they actually get purified. They get stronger. It improves them, the testing of that. They make it through the fire. Or you can be the wood and the hay and the straw and the stubble. What happens when wood, hay, straw, and stubble are put through the fire? They disintegrate and they're turned to ash, and they're no longer good for any sort of building material, at least. So they become virtually useless. A preacher's job is to prepare the hearers for both earthly trials and the final judgment to come so that we may rejoice in the reward. And sometimes, as preachers and teachers, maybe we fail to do that as well as we should. Take a look at Acts chapter 20 for a moment. And notice that I believe when Paul is offering this final lesson to the elders of Ephesus, what he's trying to impress upon them is the importance that now that he's leaving, they need to build on the foundation in the same manner that Paul's built on it. So what has Paul done to build on and to lay that foundation and build on it? Well, he says in verse 26, I testify you to this day that I am innocent of the blood of all men. Why could he say that? Well, the reason why he could say that in verse 27, because I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. I have taught you everything that you need to know to be right with God. And I haven't hidden anything from you. Now listen, if you hide and shy away from certain teachings as a preacher or a teacher or even as a parent and teach your children, you may leave your listeners ill-equipped and unprepared to deal with the problems that they may face in the future. But when we share all of God's counsel with our hearers, we make it so that they are prepared to face that. Now, if they fail, at least it's not our fault. At least we can say, like Paul, I shared it with you. You had a choice as to whether or not you would follow God when you faced that trial, when you went through that temptation, but I shared the word with you. And Paul's saying that, I have not shunned to declare to the whole counsel of God, and so take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. Because I know this, that after my departure, what's going to happen? Savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. What's he saying? You're about to face fiery trials. Because when I leave, there's going to be false teachers coming your way. There's going to be people who want to pull your disciples away. Notice verse 30. There's going to be people coming who speak perverse things, misleading things, to draw away the disciples after who? Themselves. There's going to be people coming who aren't going to build on that foundation the right way. They want people to follow them and their teaching. They want people to exalt them. Diotrephes was somebody who was like that, as we read 2 John. But he says, therefore watch and remember that for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears. What's he telling the elders who were left there? Well, keep on building on the same foundation and don't neglect to teach people what they need to hear. A preacher's job is to prepare the hearers for earthly trials and to prepare them for the final judgment to come. Now, I want to make one more point from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, because I've seen commentaries, things like that I believe teach this a little bit wrong. Some people will say, well, what this is about making sure that you're not a false teacher in verses 12. Make sure that you're not teaching false doctrine, because if you're teaching false doctrine, you're trying to build the church on wood, hay, or straw. Let me ask you a question. If someone's teaching false doctrine, if they're a false teacher, are they going to be saved? No, you can't be a false teacher and be saved, actually. But verse 15 says, if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he will be saved. Why would he still be saved if he's a false teacher? I don't think that's the idea here in this text. I think the idea is that someone has taught right, but some of the people that he has taught have not stuck with it. They are the wood, hay, and the stumble. They have fallen away. And I want you to think about that for a moment. I was talking to my wife the other day. We had heard about, we'd heard about somebody that had fallen away that we'd known for a long time with our work in Kokomo, and that was sad to us. But as a preacher, it especially hurts when you hear about that. When you hear about people that you've spent tons of time with, and you've taught lesson after lesson in class after class, and you hear that they fall away. You have a tendency to take that sometimes a little personal. For me, I have a tendency to sometimes think, feel guilty. Was there something that I didn't say? Did I not prepare them? Did I miss out on something? What did I do wrong? And I think parents do that too, don't you, parents, sometimes? When your kids aren't living the way that you taught them to live, you sometimes start questioning, did I not teach them everything? Did I do something wrong? Did I set an example? You start questioning yourself. And this passage, I think, speaks to the fact that it's our job to build. However, not everything that we try to build is going to endure, is it? Sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. But one of the comforting thoughts that I read in verse 15 is, even though you have tried hard, even though you have worked, and even though you have labored, if sometimes those who you've tried to build, if it fails, there is still some comfort in knowing that you will still be saved. You're saved based upon your work, not based upon the results. Paul sometimes had good results when he went to a city, and sometimes he went to places like Athens, and a lot of people mocked him and didn't believe. Is he going to be blamed for that? Is Paul going to be condemned because he didn't have good results? No, what Paul did was he went there, he taught the gospel, he tried to instill the message of Christ in his hearers. Sometimes it was successful and sometimes it was not. But there's a comforting thought here that you did your job. You are clean of the blood of all men because you tried. You attempted to do the best you could to build Christ in other people. You cannot control how someone will respond to the preaching, but we've got to make sure we are doing our best to prepare our hearers for the future. And so the quality of our work may one day be revealed. Sometimes it might be our fault if we're not telling them what they need to hear, but sometimes, ultimately, judgment is in the hands of God for the decisions that people make. All right, the last point that I want to make from this text is this, though. And it's from verses 16 and 17. Notice he says in verse 9, you are God's building. But I want you to see in verses 16 and 17 a specific building that he mentions in this passage. He mentions the temple of God. Notice verse 16. Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? And if anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Now, think about this picture that Paul is creating in the minds of his hearers. The most beautiful building, the most adored and revered building in Jewish history would have been the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, there were many other temples that Grecian culture to refer to and maybe could consider temples of pagan gods, for example. But as we think about the city of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, the temple was built with precious stones. It was constructed with premium wood. The term used in a lot of the newer translations is acacia wood, which would be a bug-resistant wood, similar to cedar or something like that. It was to be overlaid with pure gold. And so we see gold and silver being used in the construction of both the tabernacle and the temple. The structure of the temple was supposed to foreshadow something that was even greater under the new covenant. It was to foreshadow the grandeur, the purity, they were using pure gold, the holiness, and the beauty of the church. And so just as God dwelt in the physical temple, God's presence is to be dwelling within the lives of Christians. And when that happens in the lives of Christians, then it creates something within us and within the church that is even far more beautiful than just a physical structure, because it creates within us the light of Jesus Christ shining through us. And yet, think about this picture a little further, the Corinthians were not an attractive people at the time Paul was writing to them. It was one of their great failures. They were lacking in unity. Chapters 1 through 3 addresses that. Well, any good building, right, has to be united. It has to be joined together. You have to use some mortar to put the bricks together, and you have to fasten the drywall and the siding to the building. It has to be united and joined together, or it's going to fall. If when I was just building a house, if I had showed up there and they just stacked up a bunch of bricks and they never brought any, concrete to put them together, I probably wouldn't buy the house, wouldn't you think? Yeah, I don't think I want this. I think you guys need to actually stick it together, right? It's not a very good-looking building. The church was struggling with impurity. 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 deals with problems of sexual morality. Someone has his father's wife. There was impurity. There was unholiness. Any building that is constructed with impure or decaying or rotting materials, it's going to compromise its quality. We're not going to build a structure that we want to last for years. We're not going to take rotten wood and build it. We're going to have a rotten structure. And yet that's what the church was at this time. They were impure. They were unholy. They were rotting. And it was compromising the quality of the church. They were rebuked for a lack of love. 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 says they're competing with one another over spiritual gifts. He says, instead, you need to have love. Now, love is the glue which helps hold the church together despite our weaknesses and despite our failures. But they're lacking in love. They need to be taught about love. And when you look at 1 Corinthians 15, they're waffling in the true source of their hope. Some of them are even denying the resurrection. And the resurrection was central to the faith and central to their hope. And so when you read through chapter after chapter through Corinthians, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with who were in the adult class last quarter, it's very clear that Corinth was an unattractive church based upon many of its problems. And so Paul finishes off his thought about you are God's building by pointing to the premier building of God's people. And that's the temple. And reminding Corinth that they were to be human representations of all that the temple foreshadowed. But they weren't pure like gold. They weren't issue-free like that acacia wood. They weren't showing mercy to one another like the mercy seat symbolized. They were impure. They were filthy. They needed to wash their hands of their uncleanness like you would do in the temple. And the ultimate point that Paul's trying to make is that when he looks at you as an individual or when he looks at the church, the beauty of God should be shining in you. The presence of God should be obvious within you as a Christian and as a church. And it was not obvious in the church at Corinth. And so what's the ultimate point for us here today? Well, as the world looks at the lives that we are building, what kind of building do they see? Are they impressed with the beauty of Jesus that shines in us, just like the light would shine in that tabernacle upon all the lampstands? Do they see us as people of light and people of holiness and people of purity? Is that obvious by how we behave? Not just in a church building, but at work and in our homes and at school. Do they see that in us, or do they see a broken down, boarded up, neglected shack that is in serious need of repair? What kind of building are you? What kind of stone are you in the building? And what kind of building is this church as a whole? We need to be proper representatives of God if we're truly built in God. And as a church, that's what we have to be shining as well. We are going to detract people, and that's already happened so much in our culture and in our world. There have been people who have been completely repelled from the church because of people who have stained the reputation of the church by their deeds and their actions and their lifestyle. And we can't be those people. People get turned away from the church because of hypocrisy. We need to be people who are sincere and genuine and pure and holy. That's what God called His tabernacle, His temple to be. That's what He calls us to be as His church. So are you being that? Are you being that?